Christmas is just around the corner. The scent of turkey and tamales here in Mexico has already begun to fill the air. And it is precisely during these times of family reunions and arguments over Grandma's estate that we here at Mundo Creepy like to remember that, even during these festive days, strange, mysterious, and even disturbing things continue to happen in the world. So, get comfortable and turn off the lights, because these are 7 unsolved Christmas mysteries. How are you? Good morning, afternoon, or evening. I greet you. Let's begin. The murder of the Miyazawa family. A few weeks ago, we brought you a video about the 7 most disturbing unsolved mysteries in Japan, and it is precisely this country with which we will begin this unsettling journey. In this nation, Christmas is very different from what we know here in the West. It is usually celebrated by eating fried chicken from the Kentucky brand, and it is usually celebrated as a couple, looking more like Valentine's Day than our traditional conception of the holiday. However, despite the notable differences, Christmas in Japan has been gaining more and more strength, and at the beginning of the new millennium, right around these dates, a terrible event grabbed the headlines: the regrettable murder of an entire family and the mystery behind the killer's true motivations. The Miyazawa family lived since the late 90s in a 2-story house with an attic in the residential neighborhood of Kamiso Shigaya in Tokyo, and it was made up of 5 members: Mikio, 44, his wife Yasuko, 41, their daughter Nina, 8, and their youngest son, Rei, 6, who had a developmental disability. They were described as quiet neighbors who had no known conflicts. Their home, near Sosigaya Park and a baseball field, was part of a quiet residential area located in Setagaya. On the morning of December 31st, some relatives arrived at the house, quite worried because they had not been able to communicate with them, and what they found inside was simply chilling. The bodies of Mikio, the father, and his son Rei lay bloodied on the floor of the lower level. And upon inspecting the house, they found the bodies of Yasuko and Nina in the attic. They had all been murdered in a brutal manner. The area was immediately cordoned off by the police. At the crime scene, 2 kitchen knives were recovered next to the bodies. The main weapon was a Sekimaru Ginyu brand sashimi knife, a limited series of 15 units manufactured in June of that same year. In addition, a fragment of the fractured blade of the knife was found in the attic. The killer left many pieces of clothing and accessories in the house: a gray wool hat, a large black jacket, a green plaid scarf, adjustable black gloves, a waist bag or fanny pack, and finally a gray sweatshirt with lilac sleeves, model Jiso, were identified. The curious thing about this last garment is that only 10 of these were sold in Tokyo before the crime. Clear footprints of a pair of white Slazenger sneakers, size 27.5 centimeters, were also found. This model had not been sold in Japan, but was manufactured in South Korea. Inside the backpack and on 2 black handkerchiefs, the presence of the Drakkar Noir fragrance by Guy Laroche was detected, a perfume sold commercially in Japan since the 80s. Very clear fingerprints and palm prints of the perpetrator were taken from the weapons and clothing. Forensic analysis determined that the DNA and blood type A corresponded to a male. No evidence of gunshots was found, which indicated that the crime had been perpetrated exclusively with a knife and by using strangulation. Anyone would think that with this absurd amount of evidence, it would be a matter of very little time before the culprit was found. But surprisingly, this was not the case. The investigation was assumed by the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, creating a special team. A reward of up to 20 million yen was offered to anyone who provided useful data, and in parallel, a composite sketch of the suspect was circulated, describing him as a man about 1.7 meters tall, with a medium build, brown hair, and a possible knife wound on his hand. Flyers were distributed, posters were printed, and even a mannequin was created with clothing similar to that of the aggressor, but none of this bore fruit. With all the available evidence, a timeline of the events was then created, as follows. On December 30th, in the late afternoon, evening, the family spent the day normally. They shopped at a local mall and had dinner at home watching television. Around 11 p.m., an unidentified intruder broke into the house through a bathroom window on the 2nd floor. The killer first approached 6-year-old Rei, strangling him in his bed on the bottom bunk. Next, he went down to the 1st floor and stabbed Mikio in the living room, causing his death by bleeding. Then he went upstairs once more and attacked Yasuko and Nina while they slept, stabbing them repeatedly, although they eventually died from blood loss. In the early hours of December 31st, after committing the murders, The aggressor remained in the house for several hours, performing a series of strange acts. He ate ice cream from the freezer without using a spoon, used Mikio's computer to browse the internet, and cut out some newspaper articles with scissors before abandoning the scene. Due to this unusual behavior and the lack of a clear motivation for the crime, several hypotheses have arisen regarding it. The most famous comes from investigative journalist Fumiya Ichihashi, who in 2015 published a book claiming that the killer was a former South Korean soldier hired as a hitman. According to this man, the motive would have been to misappropriate compensation for the expansion of a nearby park. He insists that the criminal was not Japanese and escaped abroad immediately, knowing that he would never be caught. This theory has been rejected by official investigators, and the detective in charge, Takeshi Tsushida, declared that the idea is 100% absurd, and that, if it were true, the killer would already be in custody. Other speculations speak of a neighbor or a random killer with mental problems. 25 years later, this case remains unsolved. In December 2024, the Metropolitan Police once again asked for public collaboration, but there are still no detainees and no confessions. Meanwhile, the friends and family of the Miyazawas are still waiting for justice to be served one day, remembering bitterly that year, for two parents and their young children, there were no happy holidays. The case of JonBenét Ramsey. Child beauty pageants are already disturbing enough for me. The simple fact that a group of 40-year-old men are sitting there deciding which little girl with kilos of makeup on her face they think is the prettiest is already quite unsettling. But what happened to JonBenét Ramsey during Christmas of 1996 is even more disturbing. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was a 6-year-old girl who lived in Boulder, Colorado, in an upper-class family. Her father, John Ramsey, was a wealthy technology executive, president of the company Access Graphics, and her mother, Patsy Ramsey, had been Miss West Virginia in 1977 and dedicated much of her time to JonBenét's beauty career, entering her in numerous children's pageants that made her win awards and local popularity. She also had an older brother named Burke, who was 9 years old at the time. On the morning of the 26th of December 1996, after having celebrated Christmas, the Ramsey family woke up to disturbing news. The girl was not in her room, and in the kitchen, there was a long handwritten ransom note where $118,000 was demanded, threatening the girl's death if the police were contacted. Despite the text's instructions, Patsy called 911 shortly thereafter. The agents arrived immediately, and the initial investigation was oriented toward a kidnapping. Around noon, and still without any trace of JonBenét, her father went down to the basement of the house and discovered something terrible. Down there, behind a door secured with a latch, was the lifeless body of his daughter. The girl was lying on the floor, covered with a white sheet, with her hands tied and duct tape over her mouth. Shortly after, the authorities confirmed that she had died of strangulation with a nylon cord around her neck, in addition to suffering a very severe blow to the skull. The body was removed that same night, with the autopsy being completed the next day. There were several very strange things in this case, and the investigators noticed them immediately. For starters, the letter from the supposed kidnappers was unusually long, about 2 pages, with detailed and quite sadistic threats. Additionally, they asked for a very exact figure, $118,000 in $100 and $20 bills. The sum was exactly the same as the Christmas bonus that John Ramsey had received that year. From the crime scene, partial prints, fibers, and bloodstains were collected. A particular clue was the presence of a bowl with pineapple remains, which later allowed it to be verified that JonBenét had consumed fruit a few hours before being murdered. Her parents denied having been the ones who gave her said fruit. The official report determined that the death was caused by strangulation-induced asphyxia, aggravated by a strong cranial trauma. The girl had a skull fracture several centimeters long. No conclusive evidence of sexual abuse was found, although there were signs of injury that suggest an attempted abuse. The Boulder police then took the case as a homicide, and local investigation teams coordinated with federal and state agents for the investigation. However, initial errors at the crime scene committed by the authorities themselves complicated the work. For example, the first agents who arrived at the house only cordoned off JonBenét's room, allowing family members, acquaintances, and neighbors to enter the rest of the house without restriction. So, people moved, touched, and cleaned objects before the experts performed their task. Additionally, John Ramsey, upon finding his daughter's body, ripped off and removed the tape from her mouth, tried to untie the rope, and then carried the girl's body upstairs, which destroyed fingerprints and essential evidence. Despite these failures, biological samples were collected from the entire family, and exhaustive interrogations were performed. In the following weeks, the girl was buried in a private funeral. The lack of definitive results led to the creation of a grand jury in 1999 that recommended charges of child abuse and obstruction of justice against the parents. But the prosecutor decided not to proceed with the accusations due to a lack of solid evidence. Several theories have tried to explain who killed JonBenét Ramsey, but none have been able to be proven. If you know both cases, it is very likely that this one seems very similar to that of Paulette Guevara in Mexico City, since elements such as the bad decisions of the authorities in letting people pass freely through the house, or the fact that the girl was found dead in her own house after an alleged kidnapping, make them quite similar. And just like in Paulette's case, many of the suspicions fell on the parents based on the lack of signs of forced entry and the enigmatic ransom note. Many believe that perhaps one of them, or both, could have murdered the girl and then tried to cover it up by making it pass as a kidnapping. Another hypothesis speaks of an intruder who could have managed to kidnap JonBenét. Many point out that the girl, being known for the pageants she had won, could have caught the attention of pedophiles, and one of them could be the killer. But despite comparing the DNA with dozens of possible suspects, it was never possible to identify anyone. There was even suspicion regarding her older brother, as some believed that perhaps he could have accidentally killed his sister and his parents would have tried to cover it up. Another variant of this same hypothesis points out that her brother could have murdered her out of envy for her always being the center of attention. In the year 2008, an unknown male DNA profile was identified on the girl's underwear. Each member of the Ramsey family was ruled out in those tests, which caused the prosecution to reduce the direct suspicions against them. However, the genetic profile has still not matched any suspect, and the samples have been preserved for future forensic analysis. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey generated huge media attention in the United States. The press and television widely disseminated photos and details of the case. Over the years, multiple programs and documentaries revived theories and debates, although without providing conclusive evidence. Today, the case remains open. There is no confirmed suspect, nor have any arrests been made, and the authorities assure that they will continue working as long as there is evidence to analyze. Meanwhile, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey remains one of the most disturbing mysteries to occur at Christmas. The Rendlesham Forest UFO incident. In December 1980, during Christmas, a very peculiar mystery occurred in a forest called Rendlesham in England. It was the era of the Cold War, a moment in history when many countries were tense and watching one another. And near this forest were two military bases used by the United States Air Force. In the early hours of December 26, right after Christmas, 3 soldiers guarding one of the base's entrances saw something they did not expect. There were strange lights descending toward the forest, believing it could be a plane that had crashed. Sergeant John Burroughs, Sergeant Jim Peniston, and other companions entered the forest to investigate. According to the report by Lieutenant Colonel Holt, in a clearing, they encountered a strange, shiny, metallic-looking object that projected red, blue, and yellow lights. Upon trying to approach, the artifact began to move through the trees, while the animals of a nearby farm began to get strongly agitated. After a few moments of observation, this object moved away quickly, and the military returned to the base's perimeter. Around 4 a.m., local police arrived at the scene, but the only light they saw was that of the Orfordness Lighthouse in the distance. 2 nights later, during the early hours of December 28, a second episode occurred. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt organized a patrol, equipped with audio recorders and a radiation detector. At the site, they recorded very high radiation readings, and according to Holt's recording, during that exploration, a flashing red light appeared toward the east, almost in line with a farm, the same direction as the Orfordness Lighthouse. Subsequently, 3 more lights were observed in the sky, 2 to the north and 1 to the south. The brightest one launched vertical flashes toward the ground, and on the audio tape itself, Holt's reactions were recorded in real time, where you can hear him say, "No doubt about it, there is a strange flashing red light ahead. It's coming toward us. It is definitely coming toward us. It looks like an eye winking at you. It almost burns your eyes." The testimonies of those involved in both sightings have quite unsettling elements, such as that of Sergeant John Burroughs, who recounted that while chasing the lights through the forest, he heard a sound like a woman screaming and noticed the farm animals were agitated. His partner Jim Penniston claimed to have seen up close a conical-shaped ship about 3 meters high, with strange hieroglyphic symbols on the sides. Penniston related that its surface was like smooth, opaque, black glass, and that he even touched it to take photographs. Years later, Lieutenant Colonel Holt signed a sworn statement in which he affirms his belief that he was a witness to a covered-up extraterrestrial event. Some soldiers denied having observed anything out of the ordinary. The base commander, Ted Conrad, for example, declared that he and other officers did not see anything in the sky or on the ground that coincided with Holt's description, and even suggested that it could all have been some kind of setup. In addition to the testimonies, several physical signs were also reported in the place where the object supposedly appeared. In the clearing, 3 triangular marks were found in the ground, as if something had landed there. Burns and scratches were also observed on nearby trees, and some radars at the base allegedly detected the object for a few moments. 4 decades later, the case remains open. The Ministry of Defense admits it does not have a definitive explanation, but maintains that the incident was of no importance for the country's defense. Even so, Rendlesham Forest became one of the most famous UFO cases in the world, known as the English Roswell. Public interest has grown so much that there are themed tourist tours, in addition to books, documentaries, and films inspired by the event. To this day, it continues to be one of the most debated and documented UFO encounters in modern history. Many opine that it was a simple misunderstanding, but others claim that, indeed, that night the military found themselves face to face with ships of extraterrestrial origin. But without a doubt, the only thing certain about all of this is that those soldiers would never forget what they saw that Christmas of 1980. Hello. If you are enjoying this content, surely you will be interested in the rest of what we have for you, and that is that we have more channels with horror content like Noctambulos Podcast, a program where we talk like friends about quite terrifying cases. There is also Historias de Mundo Creepy, where we tell the most terrifying stories lived by our audience. Or you can also listen to creepypastas from Mundo Creepy, with stories narrated and written by us. Everything is available both on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform. The murder of Lila Anderson. This is a very little-known case, but one that at the time shocked Canada due to its brutality and mystery. We are talking about the murder of Lila Anderson. Lila was born in a small town in British Columbia and served during the Second World War in the Royal Canadian Air Force as a cook sergeant. After being discharged, she moved to Vancouver, where she worked in cafes and supermarkets. In 1950, she bought land on East 15th Avenue, where she designed and built her own boarding house. She lived there on the lower floor while renting out the top one. She was a reserved and kind woman. She loved gardening. She took loving care of her cat, Mikey, and preferred to spend her nights at home listening to the radio or watching television. She had no partner and had 2 children whom she gave up for adoption at birth. Rose Dayward, born in 1947, and an older daughter, who is believed to live in Ontario. On the afternoon of the 25th of December, 1959, Lila Anderson, who was then 38 years old, told her sister and a neighbor that she had plans for Christmas dinner, but did not reveal what they were or who she would go with. After that, no one ever saw her again. That night, upon noticing her absence, her relatives worried about her. The next morning, 2 children who were walking their dog near the Knight Street area found Lila's body in a nearby ditch. The body was naked and had a black skirt covering its head. The autopsy revealed that Lila had eaten dinner approximately an hour before being murdered, and that the cause of death had been a blow to the head with a blunt object that had shattered her skull. The Vancouver police initiated an exhaustive investigation after the discovery, but immediately ran into something very strange. No one seemed to have seen anything. According to reports from the time, Detective Inspector Archie Plummer came to accumulate hundreds of leads, sent or phone calls, but none led to anything. Traveler records and violent person files were reviewed. Similar cases were also compared, but there were no results. With the few clues that were obtained, a very superficial reconstruction of the facts was carried out. It was said that she had been kidnapped at a bus stop, dragged to a car, hit with a lug wrench, and then her head had been smashed against a rock. The identity of the killer or killers, as well as their motivations, are unknown. The authorities also offered rewards and appealed publicly for witnesses to provide information, but until today, no decisive clue has emerged. The extreme brutality of the crime generated speculation. Some media and fans have linked the murder to the brutal case of the Pulse family, which occurred just a year and a half earlier in a nearby area, insinuating the existence of a possible serial killer in Vancouver around that time. Some people suggest that perhaps Lila could have been involved in a relationship with someone, and that could be the motive for the crime, either that her partner murdered her or that said partner could be a married man, which would unleash the wife's fury upon finding out. However, there is no solid proof of any of this, so they must be considered as mere speculation. 65 years after the events, there has been no progress in the case. The file remains open in the Unsolved Homicide Division in Canada. The case has gone cold and hopes of solving it are becoming more and more distant. The disappearance of the Sodder children. On Christmas of 1945, the Sodder family was preparing to celebrate the holidays in their two-story wooden house on the outskirts of Fayetteville. No one could imagine that that Christmas Eve would end in a tragedy and would begin one of the most unsettling unsolved mysteries in the history of West Virginia. The Sodders had 10 children between 1923 and 1943, and were known as a hard-working and respected middle-class family in the Fayetteville community, which had many Italian immigrants. George Sodder, the father, prospered with his own coal transport trucking company and was not afraid to express his political opinions. He was openly anti-fascist and critical of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, something that generated friction with some fellow countrymen who still sympathized with the regime. At that time, 9 of the 10 children of George and Jenny still lived with them, as their second son, Joseph, was in Europe serving in the army after the Second World War. On Christmas Eve of 1945, the eldest daughter, Marion, 19, had brought gifts for her younger sisters Martha, 12, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, who excitedly asked their mother for permission to go to bed later. Given this, Jenny agreed on the condition that the brothers Maurice and Louis, 14 and 9 years old, complete their pending farm chores first, such as feeding the animals. George the father, exhausted after the workday, had already gone to sleep along with the older children, John and George Jr., 23 and 16 years old respectively. Jenny had settled Sylvia, the youngest of the family, in her crib in the master bedroom, and Sylvia at that moment was only 2 years old. Around 12:30 a.m. on December 25, the house phone rang. Jenny hurried to answer before everyone woke up. Upon picking up, she heard the voice of a woman asking for an unknown person, laughing in the background along with the sound of glasses clinking. Jenny hung up the call thinking that they had dialed the wrong number, and, puzzled, noticed that on the ground floor the lights were still on and that the curtains were open, something unusual, since the children usually closed everything before going to sleep. Thus, she found Marion asleep on the sofa, and assuming the other children had already gone to sleep, she turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and returned to bed. Half an hour later, around 1 a.m., the sound of a bump woke Jenny. It seemed to her like the noise of an object falling on the roof and then rolling. After a few moments of silence, she tried to return to sleep, but not much time passed before the smell of smoke alerted her. Upon opening her eyes, she saw flames coming from her husband's office located on the lower floor. She screamed to wake him up and immediately went out to help the children. The house was on fire and the fire spread very fast. Jenny took little Sylvia in her arms and went down through the smoke while George and the older children shouted to warn the others. Marion also managed to get out unharmed from the living room where she was sleeping, and in a matter of minutes, the interior staircase to the attic was engulfed in flames, preventing Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, who were sleeping in 2 rooms in the attic, from being able to go down to the first floor. Outside, George and Jenny counted in horror that 5 of their children had not come out. George tried to re-enter by breaking a window, which caused a deep cut on his arm. Marion had tried to call the firefighters from the house, but the phone was dead, and in desperation, she ran to a nearby neighbor's house to alert the authorities. Another neighbor who spotted the fire drove to a nearby tavern to call from there, but again did not manage contact with the operator. Finally, this neighbor went in person to find the head of the volunteer fire department. George, meanwhile, tried desperately to rescue his children from the attic, but everything went wrong. The exterior staircase had disappeared, and climbing the wall barefoot was useless. Additionally, his trucks, which were functioning perfectly the day before, did not start. He even tried to use the water from a barrel to put out the flames, but it was frozen. Nothing seemed to work. The fire destroyed the house in just 45 minutes. The volunteer firefighters arrived only until 8 a.m., mainly due to the lack of personnel, the lack of a siren or a telephone exchange, and that, moreover, The chief did not know how to drive the water truck, and by the time they arrived, there were only ashes. Here is where the truly mysterious part comes in, and that is that during the search among the debris, no trace of the 5 children was found. There were no bones, traces of clothing, nothing. Chief Morris suggested that the fire would have incinerated them completely. But that idea only increased the doubts among the family. Jenny Sodder, convinced that it was impossible that there would be no bone left of her children, investigated on her own and compared the case with other fires where remains were found and performed tests burning animal bones, verifying that they did not disintegrate even after hours of exposure. Soon, more inconsistencies arose. The electrical installation had been checked and declared safe, and the Christmas lights remained lit during the first phase of the fire, something incompatible with a short circuit, despite that ending up being the official explanation. It was also discovered that the telephone line was not burned. It had been cut deliberately. Days later, a man was arrested for stealing things from the property that same night and admitted to having cut the telephone cable thinking it was an electrical line, although he denied any relationship with the origin of the fire. However, there are no records of this man's identity in the police files. Added to this was the appearance of the ladder at the house, found more than 20 meters from its usual spot, without anyone in the family having moved it. Weeks later, a possible clue gave a new meaning to the noise that Jenny heard on the roof before the fire. A bus driver declared having seen people throwing fireballs toward the house, and when the snow melted, Sylvia found a green rubber object resembling a small homemade grenade. George remembered the bump on the roof and speculated that it could have been an incendiary device. For the Sodders, everything indicated that the fire had been provoked from the outside and not by an electrical accident inside the house. 4 days after the fire, and despite the family's doubts, the authorities issued death certificates for the 5 children, and a jury concluded that the fire was an accident due to faulty wiring. Curiously, an insurance agent who had threatened George Sodder months earlier, telling him that his house would turn into smoke and his children would be destroyed by his criticisms of Mussolini, was part of said jury. The family tried to obtain answers on their own, and in 1947 they went to the FBI, and J. Edgar Hoover showed interest in helping. But the federal intervention was blocked by state authorities. Even so, the FBI investigated the case informally for 2 years as a possible kidnapping, without finding conclusive evidence. In 1949, the Sodders managed to have a forensic excavation carried out, where objects belonging to the children and 4 human vertebrae sent to the Smithsonian Institution were found. The analysis determined that they belonged to an older teenager than any of the missing children, and that they had not been exposed to fire. Afterward, it was learned that they probably came from the dirt used to fill the land, coming from an area near a cemetery. Despite everything, George and Jenny kept going. In the 50s, they distributed leaflets, raised rewards, and placed huge signs on the side of the road with the photos of their children and the question about their fate. The authorities, on the other hand, refused to reopen the case. The governor gave it up for lost, and the fire chief retired without offering further explanations. In the following years, multiple sightings and clues appeared that kept the family's hope alive. A hotel employee in Charleston claimed to have seen 5 children accompanied by adults of Italian origin just after the fire, although her testimony ended up being considered unreliable. There were also reports of supposed sightings of the children from Missouri, Texas, Florida, and other places. All these without conclusive results. 2 decades after the tragedy, the Sodders received what they considered the most concrete indication that at least one of their children was alive. In 1967, Jenny found in the mail a letter addressed to her with postage stamps from Central City, Kentucky, and without a return address. Inside was a black and white photograph of a young man about 30 years old. Upon seeing it, both Jenny and George felt chills. The man portrayed had features very similar to their son Louis Sodder, who would be 32 years old at that time. On the back of the photo, written by hand, was a cryptic message. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie and Lil Boys. A 90132 or 35, a message of which it is not known exactly what its meaning is. However, the family noted only the name of their son, which was enough to ignite their hopes. And as if that were not enough mystery in this case, the family decided to hire a private detective to investigate in Kentucky. But this detective never returned with a report, and in fact, they never heard from him again. As for the photo, the Sodders added it to their advertising billboard and hung an enlarged copy over the fireplace in their home. Years later, It has been speculated that the numbers A90132 or 35 could refer to postal codes in the city of Palermo in Sicily, a detail that some link with a theory that says the Italian mafia could have been involved in this case. For more than 2 decades, the Sodders followed every trail, however remote it was. George traveled through several states following rumors, photographs, and uncertain testimonies. Finally, George Sodder passed away in 1969 without having found the truth. Jenny, his wife, continued searching for answers together with her surviving children, and during the rest of her life she dressed in black as a sign of mourning. She died in 1989 without knowing what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. After her death, an iconic billboard with the photos of her children was finally removed from the family property after so many years. The mystery of the 5 Sodder children remains open to this day, and it is very likely that we will never know what really happened that Christmas Eve of 1945. A story that is as unsettling as it is mysterious, and that continues to be remembered in the Fayetteville community every Christmas. The Cash-Landrum incident was the 29th of December 1980, 4 days after Christmas and just 3 days after the UFO sighting in Rendlesham Forest, which we spoke to you about earlier, when 3 ordinary people, Betty Cash, Vicky Landrum, and little Colby, just 7 years old, were returning home along a rural Texas road, without imagining that they were about to become the protagonists of one of the strangest, most controversial, and terrifying encounters in the history of modern ufology. That December 29, at approximately 9 at night, the 2 friends and the child were traveling along the FM 1960 road, a 2-lane rural road in the surroundings of Dayton, Texas. Betty was the driver of the car, an Oldsmobile, in which they were returning from dinner. Vicky was traveling in the passenger seat, and Colby, Vicky's little grandson, occupied the back seat. Suddenly, in the middle of the darkness, they could see a bright light among the trees. At first, they thought it was a commercial plane approaching, but soon they realized that it came from an enormous diamond-shaped object suspended over the road. They got out of the car to see it better. It was a metallic and shiny object that expelled flames from its base and gave off heat so intense that their faces began to burn, and the dashboard of the car became hot. Vicky wanted to hurry back into the car and placed her hand on the dashboard, leaving the burned print of her palm imprinted. After several minutes, the artifact slowly ascended from the place and began to move away. At this instant, dozens of military helicopters appeared from all directions, surrounding the ship. The witnesses counted between 23 and 26 helicopters of the Boeing CH-47 Chinook type, heavy transport helicopters with double rotors. From the vehicle, they saw how they accompanied the object until it was lost from sight in the darkness. The mysterious spectacle lasted between 15 and 20 minutes, after which the helicopters dissipated and only the memory of that gigantic ship in flames remained. After the encounter, the 3 suffered serious health problems in the following hours. Betty Cash was the most affected. Within a few hours, she developed thermal burns and blisters on her skin, as well as a very high fever, nausea, diarrhea, and unbearable headache. Her vision became irritated, and she lost more than half of her hair and several nails. Vicky and Colby also presented symptoms of mild burns on the skin, in addition to nausea, headaches, and symptoms such as fever and weakness. On the 3rd of January 1981, Betty was hospitalized in Houston in critical condition. She could barely walk and was barely able to feed herself. She spent 6 weeks hospitalized under intensive treatment. Dr. Brian McLean, her primary physician, declared in 1991 that Betty's case was a clear example of radiological poisoning, comparable to being a few kilometers from the center of a nuclear bomb. Immediately after the incident, the victim sought medical help and then undertook legal actions. Betty Cash, after being discharged, called journalists and experts to document her situation. Vicky Landrum initially sought an answer from NASA and then filed formal complaints. It was in this way that in January 1981, Cash and Landrum interviewed officials of the Air Force at Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin, Texas, where they explained the facts. However, they were informed that since 1969, the United States Air Force no longer dealt with UFO sightings. Shortly after, the witnesses filed a civil lawsuit in federal courts in Houston, requesting compensation of $20 million for the damages to their health. The case received national coverage, as it became an unprecedented lawsuit linked to an alleged UFO encounter. However, in 1982, the lawsuit was dismissed due to a lack of evidence. The judge considered that it was not proven that the helicopters belonged to the armed forces and that the Air Force did not recognize any vehicle in that place on that date. After this judicial decision, the victims did not obtain any compensation. In the absence of an official explanation, the evidence of the incident is based on indirect clues. There is the burned footprint that was left imprinted on the dashboard of the car, a section of the scorched road that mysteriously disappeared only days later and was repaired. The testimonies of several people who said they saw strange lights or helicopters that night. Among them stood out a police officer who claimed to have observed several Chinook helicopters flying low and looking for something in the area where the encounter occurred. Betty Cash died on the 29th of December 1998, exactly 18 years after the incident, and Vicky Landrum passed away in September 2007. Colby has kept silent about the matter, although on rare occasions he has granted interviews where he assures that he can still remember that object, as well as the feeling of heat, the fear, and the physical discomfort he felt. To date, there is no concrete explanation for what happened, and the Cash-Landrum incident remains officially as another unsolved mystery. The Christmas Truce. Perhaps some people might not like it here, since it is not about an unsolved murder or a disappearance or an inexplicable sighting, but about an event so extraordinary, a moment in history that is so unusual that without records, it could simply appear to be a Christmas tale. And we wanted to close the video by telling you this, since being a video about Christmas, we wanted the ending to at least be able to give us back, even if just a little, the faith in humanity. This occurred during the freezing Christmas Eve of 1914 on the Western Front of the First World War, after 4 months of combat where tens of thousands of soldiers from all sides died. The trenches in Flanders and northern France were a hell of mud, rats, and rain. Many soldiers believed that the war would end before Christmas and that they would be able to return to their families, but by December 1914, that already looked very far off. The cold battlefield was plunged into a somber silence. But when Christmas Eve arrived, something unexpected happened. And that is that from the other side of the front, Christmas carols began to sound. The German soldiers lit candles on their parapets and placed small fir trees where they hung some improvised ornaments. The British, a few hundred meters away, heard the song Stille Nacht coming from the German trenches and responded with their version in English, Silent Night. At first, there was confusion and fear. Some English thought it could be a trap to make them lower their guard. But shortly after, some German soldiers came out of their shelters with white flags and shouting Merry Christmas in different languages. In a letter sent subsequently by a British soldier, the following can be read. The Germans began to sing, and we responded with Silent Night. Afterward, they shouted to us that if we didn't shoot, they wouldn't either. Facing this sign of peace, the men from both trenches understood that that offer of peace was sincere. The next morning, hundreds of soldiers from both sides abandoned simultaneously the protection of the trenches and ventured together onto the battlefield, not to fight, but to socialize. There they shook hands, hugged, and struck up conversations trying to forget for a moment the hatred imposed by the war. They didn't hate each other. They didn't want to kill nor to be killed. They were simply human beings, people who, due to diverse circumstances, were there following orders from people they didn't even know. The men exchanged simple gifts like packs of cigarettes, bottles of gin, and decks of cards while they passed family photos between one side and the other. There were also exchanges of badges, uniform buttons, and newspapers from each army. In some sectors, the soldiers took advantage to fix trenches, remove the dead, or do repairs. Joint burials were also held, and both sides dug graves for the fallen of the two armies, and British and German chaplains alternated religious readings in English and German. As if all this were not enough, someone from somewhere took out a ball, and spontaneous soccer matches were organized in the snow. The generals from both sides were horrified to learn what happened. The high commands had expressly ordered not to treat the enemy in a friendly manner, and saw these fraternizations as a grave breach of discipline. The British Commander-in-Chief, Lord John French, admitted having given immediate orders to prevent the repetition of such conduct, and to punish anyone who had related with the enemy. The French, Belgian, and German armies reacted in the same way, threatening severe sanctions to any soldier who repeated this Christmas pause. Thus, the truce only lasted a few hours, and on the afternoon of December 25, while the last Christmas carols were still sounding, the military commands made the men return to their positions. In the following years, strict warnings were issued to avoid any repetition of truces in subsequent Christmases. The horror of the war did not end there. The soldiers who had socialized in a friendly manner ended up shooting each other the next day. But at least it remained recorded in history that Christmas Eve of 1914, in that freezing winter, for a small moment, a true miracle of Christmas occurred. Thank you very much for subscribing, leaving your like, and a comment. I hope you have enjoyed these mysteries and this video in general. I love you very much, and without more to say, I say goodbye. See you later.